long he sat thus, awaiting the report of the fearsome musket, but none came. He thought that maybe the crew had overcome their harsh captain and thrown him overboard. The boy's eyes began to close in the galley's warmth when Denmark stood up, suddenly alert. Somebody banged on the door, and the voice called out, "Open up, boy, it's your captain." Trembling with relief, Neb unbolted the door. Vanderdecken strode in and sat at the table. "Bring my logbook, quill, and ink from my cabin." Whilst he made more coffee, Neb listened to Vanderdecken intoning as he wrote in his ship's log. "We sail back to Cape Horn at dawn's first light. This time the Flying Dutchman will make it round the Horn. Every man will be on deck working. Tonight I quelled a mutiny among the crew. Now there are no voices raised against my command. Sin, a Burmese deckhand, was the ringleader. He no longer has to wait until we get back to Copenhagen for judgment and execution. Using my authority as captain to send mutiny or preserve good order aboard the vessel, I summarily charged and hanged him myself." Vanderdecken glanced up from his writing at Neb's horrified face. For the first time, the boy saw what appeared to be a smile on the captain's face. "If you ever command a ship, which isn't very likely, always remember this, boy. Should the voyage prove risky and the returns valuable, it is wise to sign up your crew from all nations. That way, they lack any common bond. A disunited crew is the easiest one to control. Take my word for it." Those were the last words Vanderdecken spoke that night. He slept sitting in his chair, the pepper-pot musket on the table in front of him. Neb and Denmark lay down together near the stove by the far bulkhead, watching the strange man. Red reflections from the galley stove fire illuminated his harsh features. They never once relaxed, not even in sleep. 4 days later, the Flying Dutchman was off the coast of Tierra del Fuego again, with Vanderdecken as steersman and all hands on deck, striving in the depths of midwinter to round the Cape once more. It was sheer madness and folly to attempt such an undertaking at that time of year, but none dared say so. Armed with a sword and musket, the captain drove his crew like slaves. Sleep was snatched in 2-hour shifts. Rations were reduced to half fare. Men were constantly forced aloft to cut away, repair, or adjust battered rigging. Neb was kept on his feet night and day, rationing out boiling coffee, cooking the meager scraps that were the crew's diet, and battling constantly to keep the galley dry and the fire going. It was extra difficult because most hands slept there now, under the table, on empty sacks in all 4 corners, catching what rest they could until lashed out by the knotted rope at the end of Mr. Vogel, the mate. Vanderdecken drove himself even harder than his crew, retiring only briefly once at night to his cold, stern cabin, and eating both little and infrequently. Neb had never imagined the sea more wild and cruel. Under the hurricane-force winds, icicles formed sideways, sticking out like daggers astern. There was no lee side to anything on Cape Horn. Now and again, through the sheeting mixtures of sleet and rain, the coast could be glimpsed. Gigantic dark rocks with a nimbus of ice and spray framing them looked for all the world like prehistoric sea monsters, waiting to devour anything that sailed too close. Cold and wet became a thing that had to be lived with. Some of the crew lost fingers and toes to frostbite. 2 of them on the same day fell from the rigging to their deaths in the bedlam of freezing waves. Sometimes Neb imagined he could hear thunder in the distance, or was it just the boom of tidal-sized waves crashing upon the coastal rocks? Driven forward one day, then twice as far back the next, the ship tacked sideways and often turned completely about, sails filling to bursting, then slacking with tremendous slapping sounds. Half the cargo of ironware was jettisoned into the sea to keep the vessel afloat. One morning, Neb was recruited to join a party in the midships hold, where groaning timbers were leaking water into the hatch space. All day he spent there, plugging away at cracks with his mallet, flat chisel, and lengths of heavy tarred rope they called oakum. The boy's hands became so bruised and cracked with the cold that another crewman had to take his place. Neb fought back tears of pain as he thrust both hands into a pail of hot water into the galley stove. Denmark whined and placed his head against the boy's leg. Even over the melee of waves, wind, and creaking timbers, Vanderdecken's voice could be heard, cursing the crew, Cape Horn, the weather, and the heaving seas with the most blood-curdling oaths and imprecations. 3 weeks later, the Flying Dutchman was in the same position, pushed back again, halfway betwixt Tierra del Fuego and Malvinas Isles, defeated for the second time by Cape Horn. Weary, sick, and half-starved, the crew lay in the fo'c'sle cabin. There was a terrible atmosphere hanging over the place. No longer did the men speak to one another. They stayed in their bunks or huddled alone in corners. Some had missing fingers and toe joints from the frostbite. All of them, to a man, were beginning to suffer with scurvy, owing to the lack of fresh vegetables. Teeth loosened and fell out, hair too. Sores formed around cracked lips. The 2 who had perished were not mourned. Their blankets, clothing, and personal effects were immediately stolen by former crewmates. Survival was the order of the day, with each man knowing his chances of staying alive were growing shorter, alone and freezing out on the South Atlantic Ocean within the radius of the great white unknown regions of Antarctica. Locked in the galley with his dog, Neb could do nothing but carry out his captain's orders. He smashed up broken rigging to feed the stove fire, supplementing it with tarred rope, barrel staves, and any waste he found. Water was growing short. The coffee supply was almost negligible. Food was down to the bare minimum. Still, he carried out his duties as best he could, knowing the alternative would be for him and the dog to move into the crew's cabin. He shuddered to think about how that would end up. Vanderdecken had told him that was what his fate would be unless he obeyed orders. The captain kept to his cabin at the stern, showing himself only once every evening when the day's single meal was served. Armed with a pepper-pot musket and sword, he would arrive at the galley with his tray and command Neb to open up. Having served himself with weakened coffee and a plate of the meager stew, he would half fill another bowl with drinking water and give Neb his usual orders. "Heed me carefully, boy. I will return to my cabin now. Place the pans of stew, coffee, and water for the crew out on the deck and get back quickly inside. I'll ring the ship's bell, and they'll come and get their meal then. I'll ring the bell again in the morning, when they return the empty pans. Collect them and lock yourselves in again. If they catch you without galley door open, the scum will slay you, eat your dog, and strip the galley bare. You open this door only to me. Understand?" Neb, his eyes never leaving the captain, saluted in reply and set about his tasks. Only once did a crew member venture out on deck for reasons other than going to the galley door. Mr. Vogel, the German mate, driven almost mad with hunger and cold, approached the captain's cabin. He was a big, powerfully built man. Emboldened by the ship's predicament, he banged on Vanderdecken's door. When the door did not open, he began shouting, "Captain, it is I, Vogel. You must turn the ship around. If we stay here any longer, all will be lost. Captain, I beg you to listen. We are fast running out of food and water. The men are sick and weak. This ship will not stand up to these seas for long. We are going nowhere. Give the order to put about and sail for safety, Captain. We can go anywhere. Malvinas, San Marias, Bahia Blanca. The Americas are close. There we could refit the vessel, sell what cargo remains on board, take on another cargo, and sail for Algiers, Morocco, Spain, even home to Copenhagen. Soon you will have a mutiny aboard if we sit here, Captain. You know what I say makes sense. Do it now, I implore you, in the name of the Lord." Vanderdecken cocked the big pepper pot musket. It was a clumsy but awesome weapon. One pull of the trigger could send out a fusillade of leaden shot, 6 heavy musket balls. Without opening the cabin door, he fired, the blast killing Vogel instantly. Neb and his dog jumped with shock at the sound of the explosion. Reloading swiftly, the captain marched from the cabin with sword and pistol. a maniacal light in his eyes, calling out in a voice like thunder. Neb and his crew could not help but hear. I am Vanderdecken, master of the Flying Dutchman. I take orders from neither God nor man. Nothing can stop me, nothing in this world nor the heavens above. Cower in your cabins or throw yourselves into the waters. What need have I of worthless wharf-dregs who call themselves sailors? Sailors, I'll show you a sailor, a captain. As soon as I have this ship rigged and ready, I set course again for Tierra del Fuego. I will take my vessel round the Horn single-handed. Do you hear? Single-handed. Stand in my path, and I will slay you all. Not one soul aboard thought that he could ready the ship for sail alone, but Vanderdecken did it. All night and half a day, he could be heard banging, clattering, scaling the mast, dragging sailcloth from lockers, revving lines and lashing yards. His final mad act was to slash the sheet anchors free, fore and aft. Then he dashed to the steering wheel and bound himself to it. The Flying Dutchman took the swell of the gale as it struck her stern. Off into the seas the battered craft sped, like a fleeing stag pursued by the hounds of hell, into the midwinter wastes of the ocean, headed again for Cape Horn and destiny. 1 week later, the food and water ran out. Without the captain's protection now, Neb was left to fend